Hello, this is Simon Brew. I'm the editor of Film Stories magazine, and a very warm welcome to the Film Stories podcast. I'd like to tell you this week that I'm wearing a very posh new outfit that's been picked for me by my new assistant, and I'd just like to thank her for choosing it.
Thanks. I bought it at Versace.
Come with me.
And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
And movies that had stories.
That the story just sucks them in.
This is just the beginning.
Stories. We would be honored if you would join us.
Hello and a very warm welcome to Film Stories with Simon Brew. I am Simon Brew. As always, that's absolutely everything you need to know about me. The aim of the podcast, though, well, the title gives it away. I'm here to talk of the stories of film, and I tend to talk about production stories, development stories, marketing stories, release stories, all those ingredients, really, that go to make the films that we know and sometimes love. Just that, the films that we know and sometimes love. The films I tend to choose for this podcast, they have more of a mainstream leaning to them than anything else. They're films I'm interested in or invested in to some degree. I try not to punch down. I try not to do snark. I just celebrate the fact that films are made. I really love films. I just like digging into how they came to be. Now, the first of the two films I'm going to talk about in this episode of Film Stories, I have to say, is not one of the more acclaimed movies I've covered, but nonetheless, we're going to get into the story the other side of this clip. Let me take you back to 1995.
If you can't sell.
From the creators of Basic Instinct, the last time they took you to the edge. This time, they're taking you all the way.
We take the cash, we cash the check, we show them what they want to see.
You got more natural talent when you dance than anybody I've ever seen.
She's going down to the Stardust. She's gonna be in the show.
Right? If someone gets in your way, step on them. It's not fair.
It's not about fair. It's about power.
You're a stripper, don't you get it?
I'm a dancer.
She's dazzling, she's exciting, and she's what Las Vegas is all about.
The passion is real.
I could fall in love with you.
The desire is intense.
You can't touch me, but I can touch you. I'd really love to touch you.
And the show is about to begin.
Well, that's a clip from the promo, and the not very shy promo, I should note, for 1995 Showgirls, directed by Paul Verhoeven, written by Joe Eszterhas and starring Elizabeth Berkley, Carl McLaughlin, Gina Gershon, Glenn Plummer, Robert Davey and Gina Rivera. Now, the story of Showgirls inevitably goes back to 1992's Basic Instinct, which was a gigantic hit. It's the first film that brought Paul Verhoeven and writer Joe Eszterhas together. It made headlines for all sorts of reasons, that film, not least that the independent production company Carol Co. had ponied up $3 million for Joe Eszterhas' on-spec script that he'd written, that the film was produced independently. It made a star of Sharon Stone. It gave Paul Verhoeven his biggest ever hit at the US box office at that point as well. And Basic Instinct was a cultural phenomenon at a point where Hollywood was loving its thrillers and erotic thrillers in particular off the back of Basic Instinct. That was really a kind of high point commercially for how things would go. Now, a few months after the release of Basic Instinct, as he recounts in his memoir, Hollywood Animal, and that is a beast of a book, Joe Eszterhas tells the story of how he was chatting to a producer friend by the name of Ben Myron. Now, Ben Myron produced a movie which I absolutely love, Carl Franklin's One False Move. And if you're looking to dig out terrific 1990s thrillers that might not be on your radar, let me commend both One False Moon and Devil in a Blue Dress to you. For the purposes of this story, Byron and Eszterhas were having a conversation. Now, this is the version put across by Eszterhas in his book, and he talks about how in 1992 Myron suggested to Eszterhas the idea of a dark musical about the dark side of Las Vegas. Now, Eszterhas was interested. He'd always wanted to write a big MGM-style musical, and this seemed to knit these things together. Now, there's a slightly conflicting story to this, and I guess there's a little bit of crossover that says that Eszterhas got the idea to actually write the film while he was on holiday in Hawaii, that he wrote it down on a napkin and sold that idea for a couple of $1 million. Conversely, there was the story that he tells in his book is a little bit more labyrinthine, really. That he talks of Myron going to Paul Verhoeven with the suggestion that he directed this as of yet unnamed film, that they were just noodling with the idea of it. Now, there had been a bit of afters between Eszterhas and Verhoeven over Basic Instinct, that they had not seen eye to eye on everything, and both of them are, let's just say, a little bit of a pressure cooker to both of them, quite fiery. They didn't necessarily get on. Conversely, as Myron pointed out, Basic Instinct had been the biggest hit of Paul Verhoeven's career, so it wasn't a case of he wasn't going to take the meeting, and thus coming together was convened between Ben Myron, between Paul Verhoeven, and between Joe Eszterhas, where they started talking about this Las Vegas musical. So it was Myron that pitched the idea, and Verhoeven loved it. He was really into the idea of it, and he was quickly committed to the research. In a Q&A he did a couple of years ago, he talks about Showgirls, as the film would become, being his most researched of his American films, although, to be fair to him, he argued in that same Q&A he could hardly go to Mars to check out the sets for Total Recall. Verhoeven, though, was cagey about actually committing to the project, and he was juggling a couple of other options here, because in the background was a reunion with Arnold Schwarzenegger after their success with Total Recall, a huge film called Crusades, which ultimately never happened, but Carolco was trying to set up for Schwarzenegger to star, Verhoeven to direct. And so he was really just dancing around wanting to do that film at that point. And he didn't want to commit to Showgirls until there was money behind it, that he wanted a finished script before he would say yes for definite. Now, what Myron had been trying to do as a producer was put together a package whereby he could sell the project on spec, as in it would be incomplete, and get a studio to pay for the development of it. Verhoeven wasn't keen on that. He said, "You basically said you're not using my name to sell that. I want to see a script before I commit to it." But they nonetheless agreed to go and do this research trip in Las Vegas, which they did. Ben Myron hired a researcher who took Eszterhas and Verhoeven around Vegas. And he describes in the book what we found was a hidden sexual carnival. He said there were no hookers walking the streets anymore, thanks to the town's new corporate-run squeaky clean image, but the yellow pages listed hundreds of escort services. And so they set about interviewing the dancers, the workers, the people who were living in and around Las Vegas. And Joe Eszterhas came to the conclusion that this film needed to be as authentic as possible, that the idea of doing it as a bright, breezy MGM musical was really in contrast to the stories that he was hearing. Stories of sexual assault were rife. And Eszterhas vowed at that point that he was going to try and do something authentic here, that he wasn't going to shy away from the darker elements. He was going to weave those into the screenplay that he would write. And so the tone of the project at that point had started to move. So they got back from Las Vegas, and Verhoeven was still adamant that I'm not going to commit until I see a good script. And it was a little bit of a standoff at this point, because Eszterhas didn't want to write the film for free. Paul Verhoeven wouldn't commit without a script. And so it was who's going to buckle first. And actually, it was a call that was put into legendary producer, the late Robert Evans. If you read the book The Kid Stays in the Picture, which is also turned into a documentary film, tells his story. He was heading up Paramount Pictures in the 1970s, greenlighting films like Love Story and The Godfather. And in fact, he would work with Joe Eszterhas at this point on the film Sliver, starring Sharon Stone, that was made between Basic Instinct and Showgirls. Robert Evans' brother was not short of cash, and so a call was put into Robert Evans, hope you're following, who then put in a call to his brother Charlie Evans, and Charlie Evans agreed to fund a $2 million advance for the screenplay, that Joe Eszterhas was going to be paid for this, and thus, because he then had the money in the bank, he would crack on with writing the script. In return, Charlie Evans would get a producer credit, although he wouldn't get any real creative control over the project. And so Eszterhas set about finishing off Sliver and then would move on to the Showgirls project. But his life was really in a period of transition, that his marriage was falling apart. He had a new relationship. Sliver was proving to be very, very, very difficult film. And the delivery of that screenplay was running behind, to the point where Charles Evans was threatening to sue to get his $2 million back. And as Joe Eszterhas would explain ultimately in an interview with the Washington Post, he said, "I wrote Showgirls at the single most turbulent moment of my life." He said, "The stuff I've done since then has more warmth. However," he said, "his marriage broke him, that he was in a new relationship, but he completed the script in the midst of all that turmoil." And so then it came to who's going to pay for it? The script was finished. Verhoeven was interested. And there was a point here where Carol Coe had a moment where it needed to decide if it wanted to back the film. Now, the story of Carol Coe is a complicated one, and it's far more for this podcast. And my former Den Geek colleague, Ryan Lambie, has far more on Carol Coe than I could ever give you. But it came to a little bit of what would ultimately be a Hobson's choice of projects, because the Crusade movie was falling apart, and so Carol Coe could afford to back one big film. Was it going to be Showgirls, or was it going to be Cutthroat Island, which at that point was set to star Michael Douglas? And it went with Cutthroat Island, and so it was out of the Showgirls project. Now, in the UK edition of Premiere magazine dating back to May 1995, Verhoeven tells it slightly differently of why he decided to commit to this. And he said, "It was fate that brought me back to Showgirls, because he basically turned it down at this point. He was going to do Crusades instead." And he said, "Crusades fell apart and I wanted to shoot this immediately." And he said that there were so many things to solve and no time to do them. And he was warned, really, off doing the film. He talks in this interview, he said, "When my own daughter read the script, she tried to convince me to do something else. This was going to be one hell of a gamble, really." But Carol Coe was still just about involved in Showgirls at this point, and so Paul Verhoeven really felt he owed a favour to the head of Carol Coe at that point, Mario Casa, and thus committed to do Showgirls, even though it would ultimately not make the film. But Carol Coe had given Verhoeven his break with Total Recall, so he felt he owed something back. Now, in Q&A since the release of the film, Verhoeven has talked about his real approach to what he felt Showgirls should be, that he saw it as a morality tale, a very over-the-top one, a very flamboyant one, not a camp one, which is ultimately how the film has come to be regarded. But he felt that this could and should be a film with something of an edge. Now, it still did need some backers. So Verhoeven signed up to direct, and his usual $6-7 million fee was in large part deferred. That I think it was around 70% of his salary was deferred in favour of a higher end of the back end profit should the film prove to be a success. Do not scoff, because ultimately it did prove to be a success, just not quite in the way they felt. So off the back of that, with Verhoeven directing and with Joe Eszterhas writing, there were no shortage of suitors really for this one, because again, these were the two that had made the hugely profitable Basic Instinct. And so in came MGM through its United Artists label to pay for the movie. MGM was going through one of its resurgences at this point. The film was going to cost $45 million to make, including paying back Charles Evans his $2 million. And the deal that Verhoeven managed to strike was quite a critical one, really, because Verhoeven got the right to deliver an NC-17 rated cut, if that's what he wanted. Now, if you're not familiar with the American rating system, I'll do this really quickly. An NC-17 rating prohibits anyone under the age of 17 going to see the film. This means also that the majority of American movie chains will refuse to play NC-17 films, and at that stage in the 1990s, the major video rental stores, the Blockbusters and such like, refused to stock NC-17 rated movies. It was far more preferred by studios that the maximum you went for was an R rating, and the R rating just meant that anyone under the age of 17 had to take an adult with them, but everyone would happily play R-rated movies. Verhoeven had this dispensation that he could release a major Hollywood movie with an NC-17, and that was pretty much unheard of. I think there's a film called Henry and June a few years before this that had done it and had just bombed. It was seen to be commercial suicide. Nonetheless, he ploughed forward. And so, I mean, the casting for a while looked like it was going to be quite high profile as well. Sharon Stone's name was in the mix, inevitably. Drew Barrymore was in there. Both of them turned the roles down in the film. Madonna, she then came in. I mean, she'd just done an erotic thriller called Body of Evidence, and she was interested in this, but she was interested with conditions. She wanted to see sizable changes made to the screenplay, which Joe Eszterhas and Paul Verhoeven were reluctant to do, and so Madonna just backed away from this particular one. The role that she was going to take on was ultimately taken on by Crystal Connors, was ultimately taken on by Gina Gershon, who beat out people like Sean Young and Daryl Hannah for it as well. Gershon talked, again, a Q&A you can find on YouTube actually, about how her audition for the Showgirls didn't quite go to plan. She was due to do a dance audition, but she was doing her stretches, warming up, and tore her hamstring. And so she was nervous. She didn't want to tell them that she'd injured herself. I mean, she was quite low down the Hollywood food chain at this point. She'd just done Band with the Wachowskis, great film that is. But instead of working out what she's going to do, she just thought, well, what would the character of Crystal do? And she just threw a massive strop and said, there's no way I'm dancing now, and walked out. She would go back a couple of weeks later to complete her dance audition. The central role of Nomi Malone ultimately, though, went to, at that stage, an unknown, a young actor called Elizabeth Berkley, whose main credit was the TV show Saved by the Bell at that point. Now, there were others in contention, names such as Jenny McCarthy, Angelina Jolie, Charlize Theron. I mean, Charlize Theron was said to have been offered the role, but just disliked the material and just said no, absolutely no. And she's done an interview since where she talked about what if she'd have made a different career choice there. Jennifer Lopez talked about 4 or 5 years ago about how she went in for an audition and that Verhoeven, she alleges, asked her to take her top off so he could see her topless, and she refused to do that and didn't get the role. But it was Charles Evans who suggested Elizabeth Berkley. Berkley would go and audition for Verhoeven, apparently in his hotel. I'm not digging any further into that, primarily because I don't know as well. And she got the role. This unknown was going to be at the heart of what was already a film attracting a fair amount of Hollywood trade press. This was seen as a savvy move as well. It's worth pointing that out, that Sharon Stone was an unknown when she was cast in Basic Instinct. It turned her into a megastar. Could lightning strike twice? That was the question. I think you know the answer. So on the 29th of August 1994, Showgirls went before the cameras. Now, for a film set in Las Vegas, there was a lot of location work done in Las Vegas, but most of the interiors were done back in Hollywood. Elizabeth Berkley talked in interviews about, let's just say, that clothing was not really necessary for a lot of her shooting time on the film. Verhoeven was really keen for his actors to stick to the script for this one. He wanted them to say the lines that Eszterhas had written. There's precious little improvisation that you'll find in the final cut of Showgirls. But Verhoeven and Eszterhas once again wouldn't see eye to eye on the film. That Verhoeven really wanted to push the sexual content of the film up and the nudity, and because he got this permission to release whatever cut he felt was right, he was really going for it. Now, Joe Eszterhas, by contrast, was pushing for an R-rated version of the movie, but it was very quickly clear that they weren't on the same page. Verhoeven explained that what he was looking for was a hyperbolic style to this. He described it as a heightened reality, almost exaggerated in a cartoonish way. He wanted it to be over the top. He wanted it to be over the top in a way that was fun. But then, against that, Eszterhas talks about going on set towards the end of the shoot to see what Verhoeven was shooting. He saw how Elizabeth Berkley was playing the role of Nomi Malone, and his heart just sank. Now, he was in the midst, too, at this stage of working on a thriller for which he'd been paid, I think, $4.5 million for the script, called Jade, which William Friedkin would direct. That wouldn't go down particularly well, although it's a film that William Friedkin consistently says is one that he's really happy with. Going back to the shoot of Showgirls, I mean, one particularly, comfortably, the most unpleasant, horrible moment in the film is where Eszterhas puts his take on a sexual assault into the script. And it was Gina Rivera's character who was on the receiving end of that in the film. A scene that was shot over 9 hours. And she did say if she'd have known what she had to go through just to shoot that, she probably would have had second thoughts about the role. Contrasting with that, shooting very different kind of material, was Gina Gershon, and she was of the view, as she was coming off the shoot of the movie, that this was going to be a fun one, that the tone of it was such that it would be bright and enjoyable, and that's what she was telling her friends. It didn't quite marry up to the cut of the film that ultimately came out. Still, there was an underlying confidence here, to the point where Verhoeven shot footage that we see at the end of the movie, which set up a possible sequel film that was written in, and it wasn't massively commonplace that happened in the 1990s, but it was written in an adventure that would take Naomi Malone to Los Angeles and carry on. And on the 11th of December 1994, Showgirls was in the can. But already it was bringing up, the controversy was building. The Hollywood trade press at this particular time was of the view that Paul Verhoeven was basically making something pretty much close to pornography. Now, he was giving interviews ahead of the release of the film. Going back to that premiere one, he said, he stood by, this is their words, the artistic integrity of the film that he was making. And this is what he was saying before the film was out, defending it before the film was out, before people had really seen footage. He said, I'd strongly defend the movie as being non-pornographic, but I hate to defend it on that ground because I feel we should accept pornography anyhow. And he talked about how he knew he was going to be in the crosshairs of a media onslaught at this one. But he said, I've tried to go for what's there to show the reality of this world. And believe me, there's nothing I'm doing in the movie that isn't taking place in Las Vegas right now. Now, MGM, which was promoting the film and distributing the film, obviously, it then had the job of how do you promote it? How do you put this across? And so, first of all, it came up with a 50-second trailer, which you can still find on YouTube, which was basically saying we can't show you anything because the film's too steamy and rah and stuff like that. And so that trailer was put out, and it just, it was certainly talked about. But it was clear at this point that it was moving towards an NC-17, and it just decided to embrace that a little bit. Now, Paul Verhoeven was shocked when he saw the kind of promotion that MGM was putting out for the movie, because he felt he'd made an anti-erotic movie. The trailers were promising an erotic movie. In fact, going back to that teaser trailer, you are promised a bit of fruit. There's no two ways about that. Still, the NC-17 rating was given. A website went up for the film as well. This was one of the probably the first viral, successful website for a movie. The nascent World Wide Web was just coming to consumer focus really at that point in 1995. And the idea of a website to support a film was really something of a novelty. Now, also, the consumer rise of the World Wide Web was fueled to some degree, I would suggest, by people looking for slightly naughty things. And boy, did Showgirls lean into that. Now, obviously, I didn't look at the website at the time because I'm very pure. But the website for Showgirls was racking up levels of hits that really just hadn't been seen for anything film related at this point. This was the era where you still put a hit counter on your website as well, and it was just rocketing up and rocketing up and rocketing up. And so there was a feeling that, certainly the awareness of Showgirls was high, but against that feeling, there was a question of, would people still go and turn up for an NC-17 movie in the US? Would that work? Could that work? And that was really the big experiment at the heart of this in the end. And the answer was, well, sort of no, wasn't it? However, the film, first of all, had to go before critics. And critics, there's no way around it. They did not like it. They did not like it at all. This film was slammed to the point where I just did a search before I was recording this. There are still people talking about it being like the worst film of the last 20-25 years, which it clearly isn't. However, to say there was hatred and dislike for Showgirls at the point of its release would be no exaggeration at all. There was an element that Joe Eszterhas was up for a kicking in the press anyway. He had not been shy and wouldn't be shy in the aftermath of the film's release in putting his views across and in challenging Hollywood and just generally charging an awful lot of money for scripts that some people were less keen on. I think, again, we can probably say that. But there were barely any reviewers who were willing to stand up for Showgirls at all. And so MGM now had this interesting curio that it spent $45 million of its money on a film that had been slammed to bits, but also was chock full, according to its own promos, of fruit. Would people go along? So the opening weekend of Showgirls was a disappointment. Now, again, no getting around that at all. That the movie came out and, I mean, I'm loath to say it flopped, but it was certainly a commercial failure. But you put it next to Basic Instinct and it was just nowhere in sight. So that opening weekend, it opened the weekend of September the 22nd to the 24th, 1995 in the US, and it opened in second place with an $8 million opening gross, $8.1 million. It opened up against David Fincher's Seven, which, and that was in top slot with just shy of $14 million. The other films that were around in the top 10 at that point, To Wong Fu, Thanks for Everything, Julie Newmar, which I've covered before on this podcast, was knocked off the top spot and down to 3. There's Dangerous Minds, remember that? Michelle Pfeiffer's inspirational teacher. Spike Lee's Clockers was in the top 10. The Usual Suspects, Hackers, Babe. Braveheart was hanging around after, nearly half a year, really. But Showgirls was, pretty close to a one-weekend wonder. By the second week, it was down to 5th place. By the third week, it was down to 10th. By 4 weeks, it was completely out of the top 10. And in the end, it would gross about $20 million in the US and adding global takings as well. And it just about scratched short of $40 million. And by cinema terms, not good. It's worth noting that the pile-on continued with the thoroughly horrible Golden Raspberries. I only bring them up for one reason, giving this lots of gongs. And what was particularly telling about that was that Paul Verhoeven is one of the few people to turn up and accept his award. I quite like that, to be honest. One part of the promotion that hadn't worked was Joe Eszterhas had given an interview encouraging people underage to get fake IDs so they could get in to see it. So that caused a furore the week before release as well. But then in the aftermath of Showgirls coming out and being destroyed by critics and hardly burning up the box office, Eszterhas stood up for his work. He said he put a full-page ad in Variety, the trade magazine Variety. He paid for it himself. And it was an address from Joe Eszterhas to women. That was the idea. And he said, quote, "It made the case that there was a real spiritual regeneration in this picture because she turns her back on everything that happens." And she said that the movie itself had a bullseye on it. But when I did that, I put a giant bullseye on myself, he would consider in retrospect. Now, he would also, in retrospect, concede that, coming off the back of Basic Instinct, that he and Paul Verhoeven had, quote, a certain hubris involved. He said that whole feeling of we can do what we want to do, go as far out there as we want, but they came a cropper for him. But what's interesting about Showgirls is the second life that it's had. Not all of it positive. Carl McLaughlin opened up about the film in an interview he gave with the AV Club in 2012, where he talked about his initial reaction to seeing the film. And he said, "I was absolutely gobsmacked." And he said, "This is horrible. It's very slow sinking feeling when you're watching the movie. The first scene comes out and you're like, oh, that's a really bad scene." But you say, well, that's okay. The next one will be better. And I think you can kind of work out where that goes from that point. The one person who didn't take a hit from it was Gina Gershon. She played her response to the film quite smartly, really, and escaped some of the some of the knives really that were out for those involved. Paul Verhoeven certainly took a hit, but then he was straight on to do Starship Troopers, so he would have a quick path out of this. But the person who took the biggest hit, but without question at all, was Elizabeth Berkley, the young actor who really had put herself on the line for this role. And she was the one who had to carry the can for it. Paul Verhoeven himself admitted this. He said in 2015, he said Showgirls ruined the career of Elizabeth Berkley in a major way. Verhoeven said it made his life more difficult, but not to the degree it did Elizabeth's. And he talked about how Hollywood turned its back on her. And he said, if somebody has to be blamed, it should be me, because I thought it was interesting to portray somebody like that, but the rest of Hollywood seemed to disagree. Now, for Berkeley's point of view, it took her a long time to get over it, and it was at a 20th anniversary screening of the movie in 2015. She turned up and she took the stage, and as US Magazine reported, she said 1995 was such a difficult time where taking risks like that was not embraced. They were laughed at, they were shamed publicly. And she said to be a young girl in the centre of that was something that was quite difficult. But over time, she said, I found my own resiliency and my power and my confidence. And she thanked the crowd, quote, for giving me this gift of truly getting a full circle moment of experiencing the joy with you. But it hadn't taken long after the release of Showgirls for its second life to begin in earnest, really. That within months there were midnight screenings going on, that it was quickly becoming a cult film, that it was taking on camp qualities too, that it was on that circuit of exhibition and attracting like late night shows based in and around the film. Over time, I mean, it's also worth noting, to this date, it is the highest grossing NC-17 rated movie ever at the US box office. It spawned an unofficial sequel. It spawned an off-Broadway musical. There's been a recent documentary called You Don't Know Me digging into it all. Verhoeven, though, he's sanguine when he looks back on it, and he does say the script, he should have insisted on a rewrite of the script, but it was the Carolco situation, the Crusade situation, and the speed at which they got it together. And Eszterhas himself said, and it took him a long time to be this open in an interview, he said, with Showgirls, I was shaken on an intimate personal level. I wasn't sure I still had faith in my writing. He said, I was in a meeting around that time and some assistant turned to me and said, how does it feel to be the most reviled man in America? And as he argued in a piece with Entertainment Weekly, if you're going to fail big time. Showgirls for a long time failed, but over time, MGM, which had the home release version rights of this as well, would put out different versions and various different special editions. And what do you know? It's become a DVD, a big selling DVD, and over time, a profitable film. It failed at the time, without question. It bombed at the time, but Showgirls got that second life. Which brings me to the halfway point of this latest episode of Film Stories. So I'm just going to do my quick parish notices here before moving on with the second film, because I've over-waffled as usual. If you like this podcast, if you'd like to get this podcast early, if you'd like to get the gossip on what's going on behind the scenes, then please support us on Patreon if you can. Patreon.com/Simon Brew. And if you support us there, thank you to everyone who does. The money that you put in there I use to pay new and upcoming writers to write material for the Film Stories website. I'm sure I'll plug that at the end of this podcast. It also pays for research materials for this podcast. I can assure you I'm not out drinking lots of wine off the back of the Patreon money. I hugely appreciate all the support I've had there. If you like this podcast too, please do subscribe to it at your podcast repository of choice. Ideally, leave a hugely positive review as well. For podcasts such as this, that is our absolute lifeblood just in terms of getting the word out about it. And I wouldn't be here if people hadn't had my back like that. I hugely appreciate it. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to go back a little bit earlier in the 1990s, though, and I'm staying with, I hinted before about Hollywood's love of thrillers at this point. Let's talk about one of the more successful of the early 1990s. I'm going to play you a clip from this one. I'll come to the story the other side of this.
The Bartells couldn't believe how fortunate they were to find Peyton.
I adore children, Mrs. Bartell. I love being with them. I love taking care of them. For me, it's the next best thing to actually being a mother.
But they didn't find her.
She seems terrific. What's the catch?
There is no catch. I think she's great.
She chose them.
You never let an attractive woman take a power position in your home. All I'm saying is you have to watch your back.
Now, their innocence is her opportunity.
He has your eyes, you know.
Do you really think so?
Their trust.
Peyton's been great.
Has she?
I don't know what we would have done without her.
Is her weapon.
If something happens to my mommy, would you take care of me?
Of course I would.
And their destruction.
There's only one woman for me.
That's all you need.
Her triumph.
When your husband makes love to you, it's my face he sees.
All right, that's enough of that. 1992's The Hand That Rocks the Cradle, directed by the late Curtis Hanson, written by Amanda Silver, starring Annabella Sciorra, Rebecca De Mornay, Matt McCoy and Ernie Hudson. And, I mean, Amanda Silver is the key name at the start of this story. Now, Amanda Silver is one of Hollywood's most prominent screenwriters now. This was her first script. And in fact, this wasn't a script originally written to try and lure in a studio. This was, as the Washington Post reported back in 1991, her film school thesis script, written as part of her degree, as part of her studies at the University of Southern California. Now, Silver has gone on to, I mean, just some of the credits recently. Disney's live-action Mulan, she's been working on Avatar 3, she's done the Planet of the Apes reboot movies, she's been working on those. And she graduated from the University of Southern California and developed that thesis script into a screenplay that quickly got the attention of Hollywood. And in fact, it got the attention of a company by the name of Interscope Communications. So in the summer of 1990, it was Variety that first reported the existence of The Hand That Rocks the Cradle. And this was a point where thrillers really were the elixir of Hollywood. They were on the lookout. It was Fatal Attraction towards the end of the 1980s had gone nuclear for Paramount Pictures, and thrillers were seen as not particularly expensive to make, but with potentially sizable box office returns. So there was a lot of shopping going on around. I mean, 1990, Presumed Innocent was a courtroom thriller, which I've covered before. That hit big as well. And so in the summer of 1990, Interscope Communications picked up this one, paying a $200,000 advance to Silver, and she'd get a further $300,000 if the film then went into production. So then Interscope then needed to set this up with a Hollywood studio to get it moving and to share the financial cost of the film. And it had some luck there, because at this stage, Disney was trying to branch out its branding a little bit. That there was a feeling in the late 80s, early 1990s, that the Disney name was just for kids. That if you saw Disney at the front of a movie, all it would do was attract a family audience. But what do you do with harder edge stuff? So it had already set up the Touchstone Pictures label, which had been successful in the 1980s. But now it also had the Hollywood Pictures label, through which it was looking to sell adult pictures. Not those kind of adult pictures, just things with a slightly harsher rating that you wouldn't put a Disney logo on. Although if you look through the star section of Disney Plus at the moment, there is all sorts in there. So the Hollywood Pictures had just been going for a few films at this point. His first one was Arachnophobia. Now, Arachnophobia is a terrific film directed by Frank Marshall. However, it was not a successful one because it would prove to be quite hard to sell a film about people's fear of spiders to people who were scared of spiders. Arachnophobia did okay at the box office, but other films that followed didn't. The Marrying Man with Kim Basinger and Alec Baldwin was a notorious Hollywood project. I might come to that at some point. Michael Keaton gives a terrific performance in One Good Cop, but the film didn't do an awful lot of business. Kathleen Turner, V.I. Warshawski was supposed to launch a franchise of films and didn't. And the films just weren't cutting through. And this fledgling imprint of Disney's really needed a hit. And so it made sense to sniff around an economical thriller at this point. Now, Disney as a studio in the late 80s, early 90s was notoriously frugal with its budgets. It was seen to be the studio in town that was least likely to stump up for a movie star. In fact, it would ink long-term relationships in the 1980s with more economical stars at that point, that it managed to build a collection of Hollywood hits around, Bette Midler being the standout there. The turning point for Disney had been 1990s Dick Tracy, again covered that before, a very expensive blockbuster with Warren Beatty both in front of and behind the camera. And in the aftermath of Dick Tracy, Disney vowed it wasn't just going to pay stupid money for things. Now, if Dick Tracy hadn't done great guns for Disney, it'd been a good year for an upcoming director by the name of Curtis Hanson, who had taken, there were Hitchcock influences through his films. 1987's The Bedroom Window, 1990's Bad Influence is a terrific film if you ever get a chance to seek that one out. And so he came onto the radar of Hollywood Pictures for this one, and he jumped at the chance to take on a more commercial feature. So Curtis Hanson signed on to direct this one in October 1990, and the film then had some momentum behind it. The plan was to start shooting it in January of 1991. Hollywood Pictures would put up at least half of the planned $12 million budget that it was going to cost to realise the film. And it seemed to be full steam ahead. The only thing they needed to do to hit that January start date was get it cast in time. they didn't get it cast in time, because finding the 2 female leads for this movie was proving to be a problem. That there were many stars who were said to be quite resistant to this one. So if you're not familiar with The Hand That Rocks the Cradle, this was the movie in the early 1990s that was basically billed as the Psycho Nanny from Hell film. Fatal Attraction, but with a psychotic nanny, that kind of thing. The darkness of some of the material was really putting some people off. I mean, it's worth noting we get a young Julianne Moore actually in this. She's in the ensemble. Madeline Zima as well. John Delancey, Star Trek fans, he pops up in this one. But for these 2 leads, they were seen as quite challenging ones to cast. I mean, Annette Bening, for instance, was a name that was doing the rounds at the time. She was said to have turned this one down. So it came to auditions, and there were 2 actors in the frame, really. There was Rebecca De Mornay, who had broken through with Risky Business, and at that point was pursuing a role in Steven Spielberg's film Hook, that she was apparently auditioning for the role of Tinkerbell in that ultimately had gone to Julia Roberts. De Mornay had also shot a supporting role in Ron Howard's ensemble Backdraft, the film about firemen, which I will come to in a future podcast. And so she, when she got the rejection from playing Tinkerbell, she just went on the lookout for darker material. This seemed right on what she was looking for. Nonetheless, she actually auditioned for the other role, the role of Claire Bartel in the film, and Annabella Sciorra would audition for the role of Mrs. Mott, the psycho nanny. And so, whilst those 2 would ultimately be cast, they went into it looking to play the opposite roles. Hansen would cast them, would invert that, would cast Sciorra in the role of Claire, would cast De Mornay in the role of Mrs. Mott, and finally, they'd managed to nail down the ensemble for the movie. But because this had taken some time, this meant production was running late. It had moved back its start date for 3 months. And so, as a result of that, what they also decided to do was reset where they were going to shoot the film as well. I'll come to that in a second, because I just want to touch on the fact that Ernie Hudson is in this film as well. Now, Ernie Hudson kept up his record, not a deliberate record, I should note, of appearing in hit movies, but not even getting a proper mention on the poster. Now, he's cast in the role of Solomon here, and Curtis Hanson, in an interview he gave for The Guardian, about a decade ago, explained that the role of Solomon was originally written for a white man. And as Hanson said, when we were casting the movie, I thought it'd be more interesting if the part was played by a black man, because you had this yuppie family who are a bit smug in their happiness, who embrace him, but are then very quick to turn on him. They assume the truth of the frame up. The one they believe is this blonde, too perfect nanny, Rebecca De Mornay. I think you can kind of get at the undertones that Hanson was looking for there. The locations moved from. They were going to shoot this in the Atlanta area in the US. They moved to Tacoma and Seattle in America as well. And filming finally began on The Hand That Rocks the Cradle, although this is a very quick story, really, when you consider the script had only been bought the year before, on the 15th of April, 1991. It had been a swift process to get to this point. Now, Hansen would tell Evening Magazine in an interview that the Seattle area was crucial to what he was trying to put across for a suspense film, that he wanted an area that the audience would sit there and just think, I wouldn't mind living there, wouldn't mind living in that house, wouldn't mind living in those surroundings, and just try and put the audience a little bit off guard. And he described it as a place that's at the end of a continent. It's by the ocean. They found this old house on a street that just looked beautiful, and they arranged that they were able to shoot there and in its garden. And as Hansen explained, audiences would want this life. And then the plan was that you could go a bit Hitchcock with it. You could start turning things around. You could suddenly start turning the tone of the movie into something darker. They did embrace the local area in which they were filming, not just in terms of the exteriors that they shot. They went in and shot in and around the town of Tacoma, but also they brought in local actors as well, just to flesh out some of the supporting roles. Hansen decided to shoot the film in soft pastel colours as well. That's what he was going for. He was looking for it to be attractive. He was looking for us, again, to be disarmed as we watched it. And in the movie itself, he also wanted, and this comes from Amanda Silver's script too, I would strongly assume, that the blood spilling in it would be kept to a minimum. Now, Rebecca De Mornay has a really it's not a spoiler to say, she has a really villainous role in this one. And Hansen would explain in an interview with Entertainment Weekly, she really went for it. He said, I started to say something to Rebecca about what she should do. And she stopped me and said, Curtis, I've had tantrums, let me show you. And this was for one particular moment I don't want to spoil in the film. And so Hansen explained, the cameraman and I went on top of the set. I looked down and said, action. And he said, Rebecca just literally erupted. It got wilder and wilder. The cameraman and I were both somewhat taken aback. And afterwards, Rebecca just tilted her head back, gave me this little smile like, how do you like that? It would be fair to say that she was absolutely on top of her game with the performance in this one. And with filming wrapping up on the 3rd of July 1991, there must have been some quiet confidence here. Although less so from Hollywood Pictures, which had given this a release date of January in 1992. Now, January, particularly in the early 1990s, that was a graveyard slot. I mean, you could release a film in January now and it would stand a chance of going on to make lots of money. In the case of January in 1992, a film is put there because the expectations of it are very, very, very low. It was a low-budget thriller. If it could, make 20, 30 million, everyone concerned would have been really quite happy with that. Still, the previews for it were testing very positively. I mean, Hansen gave an interview at the time, appreciating he's hardly likely to say the previews are going terribly, where he talked about people clapping and jumping as the film was playing out. But still, Hollywood Pictures just stuck with this release date, and it snuck out on January the 10th, 1992 in the US. But the critical response to this was good. There was generally, certainly Rebecca De Mornay's performance was particularly praised. If there were some problems with the setup, which they were, they were kind of, the cracks were papered over there by the strength of the performances and the fact that you had characters going really, really head to head and had quite a lot of restraint to it. And so the reviews were sitting in around the 3-4 star area. But still, nobody quite could expect how the film was about to take off. Because as it opened in that January, it opened at number 1 at the box office with 7.6 million, a lot of money for January 1992 again. It knocked Hook off the top of the box office, ironically enough. The other big opener that year, that particular weekend was Cuffs, starring Christian Slater. Do you remember that one? Which opened in 5th place with 5.6 million. The other films around the top 10 were Prince of Tides, Father of the Bride. It's all films that are held over from December. Disney's Beauty and the Beast, JFK, The Last Boy Scout, Grand Canyon, Bugsy in there with Annette Bening. Star Trek VI was just creeping out of the top 10 at that point. But the word of mouth started to grow on The Hand That Rocks the Cradle, and you go forward a couple of weeks, it's still at number 1. At the start of February, it's still at number 1. It's seeing people on. It wouldn't be until a month later that Medicine Man, which I would politely suggest is not the late Sean Connery's best film, knocked it off the top slot, but still it was hanging around. By the end of February, it was still just about just outside the top 5 as other films had come along. Wayne's World had come along, Memoirs of an Invisible Man, Stop or My Mum Will Shoot, and it was holding its own comfortably against them. In the end, The Hand That Rocks the Cradle would gross $88 million in the US alone, and it would also prove to be an overseas success too. But also it became a cultural talking point that if Fatal Attraction was the film of the bunny boiler, The Hand That Rocks the Cradle could be easily bracketed as the film of the psycho nanny, and the Hollywood thriller was very much alive and well. Hollywood Pictures had its first big hit, and so the aftermath of it, well, you would have expected really good things for all of those involved. As it happened, it was something of a mixed bag. Now, Curtis Hanson would thrive. He would go on to do The River Wild, and then he would win an Oscar with LA Confidential. Those are his next 2 films. I covered both of those before. Amanda Silver, meanwhile, who was then together with Rick Jaffa, her life and writing partner, they were rewarded with a first look deal at Hollywood Pictures. They got a couple of films going in the years afterwards. Eye for an Eye and The Relic were both on their watch. For Rebecca De Mornay, though, she was the one who got slightly short shrift with it. That she goes straight on to do 2 more Disney films, a thriller called Guilty as Sin with Sidney Lumet that didn't do great guns, and the Three Musketeers movie of the 1990s, likewise, didn't really cut through. And The Hand That Rocks the Cradle would be really the last huge hit that she would have of this era. But also, she was the one who was open about some of the problems of the film at the time. Not on the press circuit or anything like that. She didn't do it in a damaging way. But it was put to her that the backstory of her character had been a bit shortchanged in the film and simplified. And she argued that Curtis Hanson had a great instinct for what the suspense elements of the film are. I think that's pretty much unquestionable. But she said, I had to really fight with him to let me bring as much humanity to the part as I did. And she said Peyton was a woman ravaged by the loss of her husband and her unborn child. She argued she was operating out of an unconscious mechanism of rage, fear, and longing for what was taken from her. She was talking about, I'm not trying to put words in her mouth, but the implication I take from that is a mental health undertone to the film, which, mental health, it took a long time for Hollywood really to take it seriously. And as De Mornay continued, she says of her character, she wasn't out to do what she did for vanity or materialism. She wanted a home, a baby, a husband. There was something very moving about that to me. She said I had to find the emotional connection points to breathe humanity into what would otherwise be a two-dimensional character. And I do think she's successful there. I think when the conversation of The Hand That Rocks the Cradle comes up, it is her character in it, is the thing that really shines through. Still, the way the 1990s were, you could hardly make a sequel to that one. And so Hollywood just went on. Hollywood Pictures looked at doing more thrillers. And in fact, thrillers would continue to thrive throughout the decade. The bizarre coda to this particular story was by 2013, there was talk of a spin-off television series of The Hand That Rocks the Cradle. Nothing odd there until you read that it was for ABC's Family Channel, that it decided it wanted slightly edgier material for its family network, and it wanted, quote, a show that will tell the story of a young attractive nanny who terrorizes a suburban family from the inside. Now, I don't know about you folks, that strikes me as absolute A1 family viewing, and I'm just going to get the kids out now just to see if we could track down a pilot. However, we won't be able to because the show was ultimately never made. The Hand That Rocks the Cradle is also a film that's had really quite short shrift when it comes to home media releases. You'll do well to find much in the way of an extra feature on its Blu-rays or DVDs. But still, it's surprising how forgotten a thriller this is of the 1990s when you consider the impact that it had at the time it came out. There's some real, there are bits that just don't stack up. There's no way around that at all. You can certainly say that about Showgirls as well. But Curtis Hanson knew his way around a thriller. I think as a film director, he's very, very sorely missed. And if you want to see the crumbs that lead into films like LA Confidential, well, there's just a little bit of it in here. Which brings me to the end of this latest episode of Film Stories. As always, thank you so much for listening and for putting up with me. If I've not bored you to death, you can find more from me on Twitter at Simon Brew, and of the Patreon is patreon.com/Simon Brew. We're on Facebook at facebook.com/Film Stories Online. You can find Film Stories on Twitter at Film Stories Pod. The Film Stories website is filmstories.co.uk, updated every weekday with movie news, reviews, features, mayhem, all sorts of bits and bobs there. And we've got a shop, store.filmstories.co.uk. You can subscribe to our magazine there. You can buy back issues of the magazine. You can buy our sneakers, Blu-rays. I tell you, it is all happening at that shop. At YouTube, we're at youtube.com/Film Stories. We've got some developments coming there, which I can't tell you about yet, but we'll tell you about soon. I've got more live events coming up as well. I'm going to start being able to give you the dates of those in due course. Hope to see some of you there. But the most important thing, as always, is that you all take care and look after yourselves. I thank you so much for listening. I thank you so much for your time. I'll be back soon with another bunch of Film Stories. You take care. Bye-bye.
Okay, ladies, I'm Tony Moss. I produce this show. Some of you probably heard that I'm a prick. I am a prick.